Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever just looked up at the sky on a bright day and thought, you know what? I think I'd like to own the sun. Or maybe Mars. I mean, is it legally possible for a single person to just claim ownership of a celestial body? It sounds like a totally ridiculous question, right? But it's actually one that has spawned an entire industry.
Believe it or not, for the surprisingly low price of just $19.95 plus a little tax and shipping, obviously, an American named Dennis Hope has successfully sold acres of the moon to over 6 million people. We are literally talking about millions of dollars in lunar real estate. And his clients aren't just everyday dreamers either. They actually include major celebrities and even former US presidents like Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. Hope essentially just declared himself the owner of the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, and Pluto, and started handing out deeds.
And the wild thing is, he is far from the only one trying to cash in on the cosmos. Take Greg Nemitz, for example. He actually sent NASA a $20 parking ticket because their near spacecraft landed on an asteroid that he claimed was his private property. No joke. Then you have these three Yemeni men who straight up sued NASA for trespassing on Mars, claiming they inherited the red planet from their ancient ancestors. But my personal favorite? A Spanish woman named Maria Angeles Duran. In 2010, she legally registered the sun as her property. She even started selling pieces of it on eBay for €1 per square meter, promising to use all the profits to end world hunger. Well, eBay eventually banned her account for selling intangible goods, which prompted her to turn around and sue eBay. So you're probably wondering, how on earth, pun intended, is any of this actually possible? To understand the true legal reality, we have to look at the United Nations treaties and principles on outer space. The absolute foundational text here is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. And what's truly incredible about this is that the treaty was brokered primarily between the United States and the Soviet Union, smack in the middle of the Cold War. Despite all of their earthly conflicts, they somehow managed to sit down and agree on some fundamental rules for the stars. So the crucial point we need to look at is this beautifully named concept, the common heritage of mankind. This is a core, absolutely vital principle of international law. It explicitly dictates that no nation can claim sovereignty over outer space, the moon, or any other celestial body, period. Outer space is declared the province of all mankind, and it must be shared and used exclusively for peaceful purposes. Okay, so if the treaty expressly forbids ownership, how exactly do people like Dennis Hope justify their lunar real estate empires? Well, this brilliantly illustrates the heart of the whole debate. They are exploiting what they believe to be a massive legal loophole. See, the exact text of the 1967 treaty says outer space is not subject to national appropriation. So these entrepreneurs argue, with some rather cheeky logic, hey, it prohibits nations from owning the moon, sure, but it doesn't explicitly prohibit private individuals from doing it. Now, most legal scholars completely agree that this is a huge misinterpretation, that the rules for a state naturally apply to the citizens of that state, but honestly, that hasn't stopped the claimants from trying.
Actually, Dennis Hope took this loophole and mashed it up with a really old piece of American legislation, the Homestead Act of 1862. This was a law originally meant to encourage Western migration by handing settlers 160 acres of public land. Hope literally walked into a county seat office in San Francisco back in 1980, invoked this ancient 1862 law, and formally registered his claim for the moon. And shockingly enough, the agency just accepted it. They registered the claim without a single bit of pushback.
Now, while this whole private real estate market is mostly just seen as an amusing nuisance, the actual serious evolution of space law has been incredibly effective. Between 1967 and 1979, the international community rapidly hammered out rules that are literally keeping our skies safe today. They successfully banned placing nuclear weapons in orbit, they set strict rules for liability in case a satellite crashes back down to Earth, and they beautifully established that astronauts are to be considered envoys of mankind. That means if an astronaut is ever in danger, any nation must do absolutely everything in its power to rescue them, totally regardless of earthly political borders. Section 1. Where does space actually begin? The 17-kilometer legal gap.
Right, so before we can actually enforce all these great space laws, we hit a massive roadblock. We have to agree on exactly where national airspace ends and where outer space officially begins. And surprisingly, we haven't done that. It creates this fascinating physics anomaly. Think about it. A nation has complete legal sovereignty over its own airspace, but absolutely zero sovereignty over outer space. Based on the limits of aerodynamics, which was discovered by the physicist Theodor von Karman, an aircraft simply cannot fly higher than 83 kilometers. But based on orbital mechanics, a satellite can't maintain an orbit any lower than 100 kilometers. So this creates an incredibly strange, completely unregulated 17-kilometer intermediate zone where neither traditional air law nor space law perfectly applies. Crazy, right?
Section 2. Real future space challenges. Moving beyond lunar real estate scams. Let's move to the next phase and see how this all builds. Because we're pivoting away from the amusing little loopholes of the past and looking straight into a very high-stakes future. The issues keeping space lawyers awake at night today aren't people selling novelty deeds to the sun on eBay. The international community is currently staring down 3 massive, totally urgent hurdles in our modern commercialized era of space exploration. We have to figure out the rules for resource mining, the terrifying proliferation of space debris, and this entirely new, booming industry of space tourism. You see, interests in outer space have gotten incredibly crowded and pretty fragmented. We aren't just dealing with 2 superpowers anymore. We've got dozens of nations and massive private corporations all in the mix. This complexity really exploded in 2015 when the U.S. passed the Space Launch Competitiveness Act. This act legally allowed U.S. citizens to keep and sell any resources they managed to mine from asteroids or celestial bodies. It is a huge departure from that old 1970s idea that all space resources belong to some global governing body, and it's sparking an absolute gold rush for space resources. But here's the thing. As we shoot more stuff up into orbit to explore and mine, we are creating our second major hurdle, space debris. And the numbers are absolutely staggering. We're talking over 670,000 man-made particles, larger than a centimeter, just whipping around the Earth right this second. And these aren't just harmless little specks of dust. They are traveling at unbelievable speeds. Back in 2012, astronauts aboard the International Space Station actually had to evacuate into their Soyuz rescue units because a huge fragment from an old Russian satellite passed within 23 kilometers of the station, and it was just too late for an evasive maneuver. Later that very same year, fragments from an American satellite forced the station to physically fire its engines and move out of the way to avoid a direct hit. The debris threat is incredibly real, and right now there is absolutely no binding international law forcing nations to clean up their mess up there.
Well, that brings us to our final and maybe most publicly talked about hurdle right now, space tourism. Private companies are already out there selling tickets for suborbital flights. But here's the major catch. There is practically no international legal framework for this yet. Currently, in the US, space travel is legally classified as an ultra-hazardous activity. That basically means anyone buying a ticket is not considered a typical tourist who would be protected by standard travel laws. They're participating in a highly experimental venture. They have to sign these extreme liability waivers, acknowledging that their typical life and health insurance most likely will not cover them if something goes wrong. And really, that leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question to think about. Just imagine a scenario where a private citizen on a commercial suborbital flight gets injured by a piece of space debris. And let's say that debris is from a defunct 1980s satellite owned by a completely different nation, and the collision happens somewhere within that weird 17-kilometer unregulated gap we talked about earlier. Whose laws apply? Who actually pays the damages? This is exactly why international space law is more vital and honestly more fascinating today than it has ever been. We have moved from selling paper stars for $20 to literally navigating the legal future of human expansion into the cosmos. Thanks so much for exploring this with me today.